In today's reading from the Gospel according to Mark, we hear about not from the Gospel according to Mark, from Genesis. We hear about the reaffirmation of the covenant between God and Abraham. For his part of the covenant, Abraham was to walk before God and to be blameless. God, in return, would make Abraham the ancestor of a multitude of nations, of many nations. There's a lot that could be elaborated about both sides of that covenant relationship. What did it mean to walk before God? What was required by a promise to be blameless? The rest of the Torah, the whole history of Israel, the interpretations of scholars and rabbis, the stories of the Talmud, and much beyond that are in a way elaborations on that theme. God's promise as well had many implications. To be the ancestor of a multitude of nations, for example, necessarily began with the promise to Sarah. She had no children. Abraham's only child was Ishmael, the son of Sarah's maid, Hagar. And from Ishmael came one nation, the Arab nation. But God promised more. Sarah herself, he said, would finally bring a child into the world, Isaac, the father of yet another nation. And Christians have asserted, beginning with St. Paul at least, that the nations of the Gentiles were grafted into that line of descent, into this covenantal promise. So there's a lot to unpack. But regardless of how elaborate the interpretations became, the metaphor remained one of legal agreement. I'll do this for you, and you do that for me. And that's the part that St. Paul was upset about. The blessing of Abraham, Paul says, did not depend on Abraham's behavior, his obedience to the law. Because first of all, there wasn't a law at that time, at least not the law as it later became known. But mostly because Paul didn't believe that that was the way that God worked. To believe that we could be equal partners with God in some contractual agreement seemed blasphemous to Paul. And the conditions it imposed for a blessing were impossible to meet. Our very human nature as human beings makes us trip and fall with the first steps that we take when we try to walk before God, when we try to be blameless. If this is all taken as a contract, we should have read the fine print. Paul felt it was a kind of bait and switch right from the start, if that was the way you looked at it. Unless the blessing had already come. A blessing that allowed what was impossible to be possible. In the very next section of this letter to the Hebrews, Paul tells them that God shows his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. The blessing of God isn't based on what we do, however you understand what being blameless might be. Our walking before God comes out of our faith in response to a graceful relationship with God. The very fine print says it will all be okay. It's always been okay. God's love is unconditional. So our faith is not belief in something. Our faith is an open-hearted relationship with someone. Someone who said yes before we even asked the question. And I don't know if what I took from all this really has to do with what the lessons were trying to say, but it brought me to mind of a line of thinking I've been on for quite a while, and it seems to me relevant for the work that we do during Lent, especially this year. The misunderstanding of the covenant as involving obedience to the law is a part, I think, of the problem of abstraction, the problem of misapplied objectivity, seeing faith in an abstract way, standing back to think about it, to assess it, agree or not agree. And we're really good at that as human beings. It's probably why we're called Homo sapiens. It means wise man. It's how we figure things out, how we protect ourselves from danger in the world, how we make sure we have enough to eat. Someone thought about how to make grain grow where it wasn't naturally coming up. And they did that by narrowing their perspective and eliminating unnecessary information, objectifying the problem. Someone thought about how to make a spear and figured out how you could use it to hunt, how you could use it to succeed in war. There's that scene at the beginning of the movie 2001 where the ape discovers he can use a bone as a tool. Then in the next scene, he kills another ape with it. And then in the next scene, we're on our way to the moon. When we abstract, we stand back and think objectively, we inevitably then lose relationship with whatever it is we're trying to manipulate, because relationship, when trying to manipulate things or control things or be objective, clouds that kind of thinking. We lose a connection with whatever it is we're trying to control. We lose our connection, trading love for utility. Most negatively, we experience that when we try to control people. When we try to use other people, manipulate other people. Sometimes we think we're trying to help them. Sometimes we're trying to protect ourselves from them. But seeing someone objectively makes it impossible really to know them as they are. We see them only as some abstraction, some idea of them, rather than the reality, which requires that connection. And abstraction isn't only a problem with people. We're even more likely to see the earth as an object and the things all around us. We only really began to mess up the earth, destroy the environment, start bringing on serious climate change when we began to see the earth only as some resource to use. When we stopped connecting with it and started objectifying it, it becomes an object in our life. We see the earth as an abstract site, to something placed, some site to put things on, rather than a place to be. Even as Francis said, the earth as our mother. We lose touch with Brother Sun and Sister Moon, trying to figure out how they could provide us energy or bases for interstellar escape. The systemic racism that's risen up again in our conscious and conscience lately, and is a very big part of current Episcopalian thought and action at both the national and diocesan level, is based almost totally on objective abstraction, taking the place of any kind of human relationship. So-called race is fully almost a generalization, a judgment that's imposed that is based on very fluid differences in people's appearance that don't even exist as they're perceived. I've never seen a black person or a white person. I've seen brown people and tan people and pink people, orange people lately, but not black, not white. Everyone is way more complex than those categories that don't even express reality in general. Everyone's unique. And yet race has become a repository for so much of this country's fear and guilt that it's torn us apart for centuries. You can't think like that about other people. And coming back to St. Paul's insight, faith can never be an abstraction, an objectified experience, the law, or any other kind of objective demand. The function of our religious life is to cut through that alienation that we're born into, to remind ourselves that it's safe to love. It's safe to allow our lives to be connected and to be in other people's hands, in the hands of the earth, hands of nature. That we're able to love and not just think about love. Apart from it's really quite useful. I got my first vaccine shot yesterday. I'm glad we have objective science, but apart from its useful but limited purpose, abstract thinking misapplied leads us inevitably to a lie. Once something is taken out of its living connections, it ceases to be what it really is and becomes something for us to manipulate ourselves as we like. That's why alternative facts take over the scene. And Peter's affirmation in the gospel today, or what just precedes it, that Jesus is the Messiah, starts out as an abstraction. Peter associates Jesus with his own pre-existing ideas about the Messiah. The greatness of it and the holiness rubbing off on everybody around him. Jesus says that's satanic, that kind of abstraction. It's the human way, not the divine way of thinking. only subject-to-subject relationship with the full reality of Jesus, moment by moment, open to experience, can allow that alienating abstraction to be overcome. We're so trapped in it, including in church. Our reality as a whole, our destiny may not seem as pleasant as the abstract fantasies that we might prefer. It will likely involve suffering. Jesus says it involves taking up the cross and following him. It may even involve the loss of life. But beyond that, there's glory. If we stay in the experience, if we keep the subjective connection, if we risk being real. And beyond Lent, there's Easter. More truth and love than we can ever imagine. And that's real too. Thanks be to God.